Far from the cities, where paved roads turned into dirt paths and the countryside rolled on for miles, there stood a place that was more than just a farm. The Grayson Homestead, as it came to be known, was not a simple house or barn, it was a landmark of whispers, a fixture of rural legend. Its wide field stretched into the horizon, bordered by forests that locals swore never seemed to lose their shadows, even at noon. The homestead was vast, but its most infamous structure was the barn. Large, looming, built of heavy timber that had aged into a dark, almost black color, it dominated the landscape like a cathedral of secrets. To those who lived nearby, the barn wasn't just a storage place for grain or animals, it was a presence. Farmers told stories of how, on certain nights, a low hum seemed to emanate from within its walls, like the sound of bees trapped in a wooden hive. Travelers claimed that lanterns sometimes glowed behind its shuttered windows long after the Grayson family had retreated for the evening. The Graysons themselves were no ordinary landowners. They were wealthy, yes, and powerful, but they carried with them a reputation that made others uneasy. It wasn't merely envy that fueled gossip, it was the sense that the family operated by rules no one else understood. They were reclusive, they married within their circle, and they seemed to possess knowledge, of medicine, of preservation, of rituals, that was out of step with their time. This atmosphere of suspicion wrapped itself around the homestead like ivy, growing thicker with each passing year. And so the barn stood, looming, a silent monument to both prosperity and unease, waiting for the day when its most terrible secret would be revealed. The story of the Grayson homestead might have slipped into obscurity, remembered only by aging farmers and curious wanderers, if not for what was discovered within that barn. The year was one marked by storms, when lightning split trees and heavy rains turned the roads into rivers of mud. One such storm, ferocious and unrelenting, battered the homestead for 3 days. When the clouds finally cleared, a section of the barn's roof had collapsed, exposing what had been hidden inside for decades, maybe longer. What the searchers found was not a collection of dusty tools or rotting hay. It was bodies. At first, perhaps a handful, or so they thought. But as their eyes adjusted to the darkness and their courage grew enough to step farther inside, they realized it was not a handful at all. Families, entire families, were there. Mothers, fathers, children. 22 families in total. And they were not skeletons or rotting corpses. They were preserved, unnaturally so. Their faces still bore expressions of fear, of prayer, of frozen silence. Their skin clung tightly to bone, leathery but intact, as if time itself had chosen to pause within those walls. Some were seated as though caught mid-meal, others stood in clusters, clutching one another. Not a mass grave, not a burial, but a tableau, a ghastly portrait of life cut short and preserved against reason. The townspeople who saw this sight could scarcely comprehend it. Rumors spread instantly. The barn, already a place of suspicion, was now the epicenter of horror. Farmers locked their doors. Priests warned their congregations of evil dwelling in their midst. And in hushed voices, the people asked, how could dozens of families end up here, together, and remain untouched by decay? In the aftermath of the discovery, explanations were demanded. Officials from nearby counties came to investigate, but even they struggled to agree on what they were seeing. Some suggested a natural phenomenon, perhaps the wood of the barn contained chemicals that slowed decay, or the airflow through the cracks created an environment like a tomb. Others claimed the families had been deliberately embalmed, though who would have performed such a massive undertaking, and why, remained unanswered. There were no records of mass death in the area, no plague sweeping through at that time, no signs of violence on the preserved bodies. It was as though these people had simply lain down, together, and crossed into death's embrace simultaneously. But for many, the scientific explanations rang hollow. The barn, they insisted, had always been strange. Old men spoke of seeing figures moving between its slats at night, though the doors had been locked. Children dared one another to touch its walls, only to recoil from a chill that lingered on the wood. And then there were the whispers, claims that the Graysons had dabbled in things no God-fearing family should, that they had held ceremonies in the barn with chants no one could understand. The idea that the families were mummified by nature seemed far too convenient. The truth, some feared, was darker. Perhaps they were preserved not by air or wood, but by a pact. A pact that tied their souls to the very beams of the barn, ensuring they could never leave, even in death. And so, the legend of the Grayson homestead grew into something larger than fact. The barn, once just a landmark in the countryside, became a warning. Travelers avoided the area, lest they, too, vanish. Scholars wrote of it in obscure journals, citing it as one of the most baffling preservation mysteries in rural history. Paranormal investigators spoke of it in breathless tones, listing it alongside the catacombs of Paris and the ossuaries of Eastern Europe. Yet for all the theories, for all the investigations, the truth has never been fully known. In this documentary, we will peel back the layers of this chilling history. We will explore the origins of the Grayson family, the life they built in isolation, the strange silence that settled over their land, and the terrible discovery that made their name synonymous with horror. Along the way, we will sift through folklore and fact, scientific reasoning and supernatural speculation, to try and glimpse the truth of what really happened in that barn. Prepare yourself, for this is not just the story of a building or a family. It is a story of death, mystery, and the uncanny. A story that forces us to confront the limits of what we understand about life, and what lies beyond it. This is the macabre history of the Grayson homestead, the barn where 22 families were found mummified. The story of the Grayson homestead begins not with the barn, nor with the mummified families, but with the arrival of the Grayson family itself. In the early 1800s, America was still carving out its identity. The land was vast, fertile, and untamed. Settlers from the East Coast pushed inland, buying and claiming acres where they could, dreaming of prosperity. Among them was a man named Nathaniel Grayson, the patriarch of what would become a legacy shrouded in both wealth and dread. Nathaniel was not a poor farmer scraping for survival. He arrived with money, influence, and rumors of business ventures in shipping and trade. Some said he made his fortune in tobacco, others whispered darker tales, that his wealth had roots in smuggling or dealings better left unspoken. What made the Grayson purchase unique was not only the size of the estate, hundreds of acres of farmland and forest, but the isolation of it. The nearest town was nearly a day's ride away. Neighbors, though scarce, noted how quickly the Graysons set to work building not just a house, but a compound. The homestead grew rapidly, a sprawling farmhouse, stables, workers' quarters, and finally, the massive barn that would one day become infamous. The barn itself was built on a scale unusual for its time. Where most families raised simple, functional structures, Nathaniel's barn was immense, with hand-hewn beams and towering lofts. Some speculated it was designed for more than storing crops or livestock, though no one could say what purpose it truly served. The Graysons quickly became a dominant presence in the region. They hired workers, brought in tenant families, and turned the land into one of the most productive farms in the county. Yet even as prosperity blossomed, an unease lingered. The family rarely joined church gatherings, rarely attended festivals, and always seemed to keep outsiders at a polite but chilling distance. From the beginning, the Graysons were different, and people noticed. As years passed, the Graysons' reputation grew more complex. On one hand, they were respected for their success. Their crops thrived, their livestock was plentiful, and their wealth spread into the small town through trade. Yet there was something about the family that unsettled their neighbors. Unlike other settlers, the Graysons held themselves apart. They were educated, literate, and often traveled to cities, bringing back books, artifacts, and practices unfamiliar to the simple farming folk. It was said that Nathaniel's wife, Margaret Grayson, practiced a form of medicine learned from Europe. She brewed tinctures, poultices, and tonics that seemed to cure illnesses when the local doctor failed. Some praised her as a healer, but others whispered she was a witch. More unsettling still was the family's tendency to conduct gatherings late into the night. From across the fields, lanterns could be seen burning in the barn, and sometimes, faint sounds, chanting, or perhaps singing, drifted through the night air. Few dared investigate. Those who did claimed they heard words in a language they did not recognize. Children in the area were warned never to approach the homestead after dark. Travelers were told to keep their distance. And yet, despite these warnings, many depended on the Graysons for their livelihood. Tenant farmers worked the land, lived in cottages on the estate, and answered to Nathaniel's rules. The Grayson name carried weight, but not the warmth of community leaders. Instead, it carried an edge of fear. Some even believed the family had struck a bargain with forces beyond this world, trading something intangible for their continued prosperity. Whether this was born of envy or genuine suspicion, no one could say. But the reputation of the Graysons, as wealthy, powerful, and possibly dangerous, was firmly established. Of all the structures on the Grayson property, none commanded more attention, or unease, than the barn. Built in the 1820s, it rose higher than any other barn in the region, with beams said to have been cut from trees that no one remembered being felled. The timber was darker than expected, and locals swore that when you stood inside, the wood seemed to swallow the light of lanterns. The barn was meticulously constructed, with unusual features, hidden alcoves, reinforced flooring, and ventilation systems ahead of its time. Farmers who came to deliver goods remarked that the barn smelled faintly of chemicals, though no one could identify them. Officially, it was used to store grain and livestock. Unofficially, it became the subject of rumors. Neighbors said the Graysons often gathered large groups inside, sometimes for hours, sometimes all night. There were reports of smoke drifting from its lofts, though no fire could be seen. Some even swore that animals brought into the barn came out differently, spooked, trembling, or in some cases, never seen again. Whatever its true purpose, the barn quickly became more than just a storage building. It was a place of secrecy, of speculation, and of dread. Over time, it would become the central figure in the most macabre discovery the county had ever known. By the 1830s, the Graysons had established themselves as a force in the region. Their homestead thrived, their barns and fields yielded more than most, and their influence stretched farther than their land. Yet alongside their prosperity grew an undercurrent of unease that never seemed to fade. Strange disappearances began to circulate in whispers. A traveling merchant who was last seen making a delivery to the Grayson estate never returned. A tenant family, bound by contract to the Graysons, vanished without a trace, leaving their cottage stocked with food and belongings. These incidents were never proven to be linked to the Graysons, but suspicion always pointed in their direction. The family's own behavior did little to ease fears. They rarely spoke of their origins, and when questioned, Nathaniel would only smile and say, "The past is a place best left buried." Margaret was seen less often as the years went on, though the faint glow of lanterns in the barn suggested her work, or whatever took place within, continued. Some said the family was experimenting with preservation techniques, perhaps related to Margaret's knowledge of medicine. Others went further, claiming that what was happening in the barn had nothing to do with healing, but with binding, holding something, or someone, beyond death itself. And so, long before the terrible discovery that would one day shock the world, the Grayson homestead was already a place of fear and fascination. Its origins, rooted in mystery and secrecy, laid the foundation for the macabre history that was yet to come. The barn, the family, and the land itself seemed touched by something unnatural, something waiting for the moment when its truth would be revealed. The Grayson homestead was never just another farm, it was an entire world unto itself. Unlike the small family farms scattered across the countryside, the Grayson estate was more like a private village. Tenant cottages dotted the edges of the fields, barns and sheds formed a network of workspaces, and the main farmhouse rose like a stately manor, its wide porch watching over everything below. To an outsider, it seemed almost idyllic, families working the land, children playing in the meadows, smoke curling from chimneys in the evening sky. Yet beneath this pastoral image lay a strange truth: the Graysons ruled their land with an invisible hand, and life within their borders was unlike life anywhere else. The homestead was so isolated that many tenant families could go weeks without seeing the nearest town. They relied on the Graysons for everything: food, tools, medicine, even spiritual guidance. And while most farming families gathered at local churches on Sunday mornings, the Graysons and their tenants often held their own gatherings, always on the homestead, never outside it. This separation created an invisible boundary between the Grayson estate and the wider world, a boundary that grew stronger with each passing year. The homestead was, in every way, its own society, governed by its own rules. Outsiders who visited often left with an uneasy feeling, as if they had stepped into a place where time moved differently, where traditions and customs had grown twisted under the weight of secrecy. Life under the Graysons was not lawless, but neither was it free. Nathaniel Grayson was known to impose rules upon his tenants that went far beyond what most landowners required. Curfews were common, families were instructed to remain indoors after dusk unless summoned. Certain areas of the property, particularly the barn and its surrounding field, were forbidden without explicit permission. Children were discouraged from wandering, and those who disobeyed were said to face harsh punishments. Some families claimed that breaking these rules meant being asked to leave the homestead entirely, though where they went afterward was a question no one could answer. The Graysons also imposed curious rituals. At the start of every harvest, families were required to gather in the barn for a ceremony. Officially, it was a blessing for the fields and livestock. But witnesses described the gatherings as unsettling. The Graysons would lead the group in a strange chant, repeating words in a language few could identify. Sometimes, livestock were brought in and slaughtered on the barn floor, their blood pooled and carefully collected before being disposed of in ways that no one was allowed to see. Tenant families, dependent on the Graysons, had little choice but to participate. Some claimed these rituals ensured bountiful harvests and protection from sickness. Others whispered that they were part of something far darker, a pact that required obedience, secrecy, and sacrifice. Despite the strict rules and eerie customs, life on the Grayson homestead was undeniably prosperous. Families who worked the land rarely went hungry. Crops grew taller and fuller than those of neighboring farms. Livestock thrived, producing milk and meat in abundance. Even during seasons when disease or blight devastated nearby farms, the Graysons' fields seemed untouched. Tenant families who had once struggled to survive now lived in relative comfort, with food on the table and roofs over their heads. This prosperity, however, came at a cost. The more successful the homestead became, the more it drew suspicion from the outside world. How could the Graysons avoid the hardships that plagued others? How did they always seem to have enough, even in lean times? Outsiders whispered that their success was unnatural. Tenant families, though well-fed, lived under constant fear of the Graysons' disapproval. They were warned not to question, not to speak of what they saw in the barn, and not to share the details of their lives beyond the homestead's borders. Prosperity, in the Grayson world, was never free. It came with a silence that weighed heavily on those who lived there, a silence that would only deepen as the years went on. As generations of families lived and died under the shadow of the Grayson estate, rumors became as much a part of daily life as the work itself. Tenant children whispered of ghostly figures seen moving in the barn lofts, even when the doors were locked tight. Women spoke of strange herbs delivered to them by Margaret Grayson, herbs that healed fevers but left behind unsettling dreams. Men muttered of deals struck behind closed doors, where those who disobeyed the Graysons were never seen again. Most disturbing were the stories of entire families that seemed to vanish. Sometimes, a tenant cottage would be found abandoned, with food still on the table, clothing left in trunks, and livestock waiting to be fed. The Graysons would claim the family had moved on, heading west in search of opportunity. But neighbors noticed that these disappearances happened quietly, without farewells, without wagon tracks leaving the property. Some believed these families had defied the Graysons' rules and paid the price. Others feared something far worse, that they had been taken into the barn, never to emerge again. The whispers of the tenants never reached beyond the homestead, for fear of reprisal. And so, the Grayson estate remained an island of prosperity, cloaked in dread, untouched by outside eyes. At the center of all this life, both its prosperity and its fear, stood the barn. It was not only the physical heart of the homestead but its spiritual core. Every major event seemed to lead back to it: harvest ceremonies, night gatherings, disappearances. For the tenant families, the barn was both a place of reverence and terror. To enter it was to submit to the will of the Graysons, to participate in rituals few understood but none dared to refuse. Even from the outside, the barn dominated the landscape. Its towering frame loomed over the fields like a sentinel, its dark timbers aging into something almost black. At night, faint lights flickered within, and strange sounds echoed across the farmland: chants, drums, sometimes the piercing cries of animals, or perhaps people. Over time, the barn became less a building and more a symbol. It represented the isolation of the Grayson homestead, a world apart from the rest of society. It was a place where rules were different, where prosperity came with silence, and where fear took root in the hearts of those who lived in its shadow. For those who dared to speak of it, the barn was not a house for animals or grain. It was a house for secrets, a monument to the strange life the Graysons built in isolation, and the grim foundation for the horrors that would one day be uncovered within its walls. By the middle of the 1800s, the Grayson homestead was at its peak. The fields still yielded abundantly, the barns were full, and the tenants went about their lives under the strict but steady watch of the Graysons. To the outside world, it appeared to be a success story, land tamed and made prosperous by hard work and clever management. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, a strange phenomenon began to emerge: silence. It started small. A tenant family, once lively and social, suddenly seemed absent. Their cottage was empty, their belongings untouched. The Graysons explained it away, saying the family had left for opportunities farther west. A few believed them, but many whispered that the family had simply vanished. Then came another disappearance. And another. Over the span of several years, tenant families seemed to vanish with increasing frequency. Entire cottages stood abandoned, sometimes with meals left unfinished on tables, livestock unattended, and children's toys still lying in the dirt. Each time, the Graysons gave the same explanation: migration, bad debts, family quarrels. Yet these explanations rang hollow. Why would so many leave so suddenly, without taking wagons, supplies, or farewells? Why was there no word of them in neighboring counties? It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. For those who remained, a terrible dread settled over the homestead. Families spoke less, children played quietly, and the once lively chatter of tenant gatherings dwindled to whispers. No one dared ask too many questions, for fear of drawing the Graysons' gaze. The silence was not just absence, it was fear, thick and heavy, stretching across the fields and into the cottages. The Grayson estate, once vibrant with life, began to sound more like a graveyard, where voices vanished one by one until only echoes remained. Outside the homestead, townspeople began to notice the pattern as well. Shopkeepers who once sold goods to tenant families no longer saw their familiar faces. Priests wondered why congregants who had once attended their churches now vanished from pews. County officials attempted to record population changes, but the Graysons always seemed to provide paperwork, leases, contracts, exit notes, suggesting the families had moved on. Strangely, no official could ever trace where those families had gone. Letters sent to supposed destinations never received replies. Relatives searching for loved ones came up empty-handed. When questioned, Nathaniel Grayson responded with charm and composure. He insisted that life on the frontier was difficult, that families often moved suddenly in search of better prospects. He even produced receipts showing supplies purchased for journeys westward. But something about the records felt off. Dates didn't match. Signatures looked unfamiliar. And most importantly, not a single eyewitness ever claimed to see wagons leaving the property. It was as though the families had evaporated into thin air. This mystery deepened when county clerks realized that birth and death records from the Grayson estate were strangely incomplete. Children were said to be born but never baptized. Deaths occurred but were never recorded in church registers. It was as if the Graysons were deliberately erasing the traces of the people who lived under their control. Slowly, a terrible suspicion began to take root. Perhaps the families were not moving away at all. Perhaps they were still on the homestead, hidden somewhere no one dared to look. The farms surrounding the Grayson property began to share their own unsettling stories. A farmer on the southern border claimed he heard screams echoing from the barn on a moonless night, followed by silence so complete it chilled his bones. Another neighbor swore he saw groups of people entering the barn in the dead of night, but never saw them come back out. Still others reported seeing lantern light flickering in the upper windows long after midnight, accompanied by shadows moving unnaturally across the walls. These accounts spread quickly, but speaking of them aloud carried danger. Those who voiced their concerns too loudly often found themselves visited by Nathaniel Grayson himself, who would smile, reassure, and dismiss the claims as superstition. And yet, the rumors never stopped. If anything, they grew stronger. Some claimed the barn was being used not for farming, but for rituals that demanded participants who never returned. By this time, the surrounding community had become divided. Some defended the Graysons, insisting that their success was proof of their hard work and intelligence. Others quietly accused them of harboring something monstrous, of hiding secrets too terrible to name. What united both sides was fear. Whether through respect or suspicion, the Graysons ensured that no one dared challenge them directly. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones, but none dared step foot on the homestead to see the truth with their own eyes. As the disappearances mounted, the silence of the Grayson estate became uncanny. Once, the fields had been filled with the noise of children laughing, workers calling to one another, animals braying and clucking. Now, more often than not, they were quiet. Families still lived there, but they spoke in whispers, worked in nervous silence, and avoided one another's eyes. Even the animals seemed affected. Horses shied away from the barn, cows grew restless at dusk, and dogs howled at the building as though sensing something unseen. Travelers who passed by remarked on the unnatural quiet. They said the homestead felt heavy, as though the air itself resisted sound. The silence was broken only by occasional, inexplicable noises from the barn, low hums, strange rhythms, and sometimes, faint cries that stopped abruptly. For those living within the homestead, silence became both a shield and a prison. No one wanted to draw attention. No one wanted to speak of what they feared. And so, an entire community lived as if muted, bound together by terror and the unspoken knowledge that something was terribly wrong. The homestead, once a place of prosperity, had transformed into a place where joy had been smothered, leaving behind only whispers and dread. By the late 1850s, the Grayson homestead was a paradox, outwardly thriving, inwardly decaying. Its crops continued to yield, its wealth remained intact, but its people were disappearing into silence. Outsiders could sense the strangeness but never prove it. Insiders could feel the dread but never speak it. And at the heart of it all, the barn loomed, darker and more ominous with each passing year. What no one knew then was that this silence was not the end but the prelude. The disappearances, the erased records, the whispers of screams, these were all leading to something greater, something far more terrifying than anyone dared imagine. For within the walls of that barn, preserved by forces unknown, lay the truth. 22 families, their lives cut short and their bodies held in defiance of time itself, were already waiting. The silence of the Grayson homestead was not simply the absence of sound. It was the breath held before a scream, the pause before revelation. It was the warning of a horror that would one day be uncovered, shocking the world and cementing the Grayson name in macabre history forever. The Grayson homestead no longer stands as it once did. Time, storms, and human hands have worn it down, scattering pieces of its story across crumbling wood and fading memories. The farmhouse is gone, the tenant cottages have rotted into the soil, and the once prosperous fields have grown wild with weeds and silence. Only fragments of the barn remain, skeletal beams jutting from the earth like the bones of a fallen giant. Yet even in ruin, the place still breathes with unease. Visitors who dare step onto the land describe an almost palpable heaviness, as though the air itself remembers what happened there. The story of the 22 families has become legend, passed from mouth to ear, reshaped with every retelling. Some call it a tale of tragedy, others insist it is evidence of ritualistic evil, while skeptics reduce it to folklore inflated by fear. But whether one believes or doubts, the shadow of the Grayson homestead lingers. It is a reminder that even the most prosperous of places can hide decay at their core, and that silence is often the loudest warning of all. The legacy of the Graysons is not one of wealth or achievement, but of shadows, shadows that refuse to die, clinging to the memory of that barn and the secrets it held. The Grayson homestead no longer stands as it once did. Time, storms, and human hands have worn it down, scattering pieces of its story across crumbling wood and fading memories. The farmhouse is gone, the tenant cottages have rotted into the soil, and the once prosperous fields have grown wild with weeds and silence. Only fragments of the barn remain, skeletal beams jutting from the earth like the bones of a fallen giant. Yet even in ruin, the place still breathes with unease. Visitors who dare step onto the land describe an almost palpable heaviness, as though the air itself remembers what happened there. The story of the 22 families has become legend, passed from mouth to ear, reshaped with every retelling. Some call it a tale of tragedy, others insist it is evidence of ritualistic evil, while skeptics reduce it to folklore inflated by fear. But whether one believes or doubts, the shadow of the Grayson homestead lingers. It is a reminder that even the most prosperous of places can hide decay at their core, and that silence is often the loudest warning of all. The legacy of the Graysons is not one of wealth or achievement, but of shadows, shadows that refuse to die, clinging to the memory of that barn and the secrets it held. In examining the tale of the Grayson homestead, we find ourselves standing at the boundary between history and folklore. Some evidence remains, fragments of records, second-hand accounts, scattered reports that mention disappearances and strange gatherings. But much of what we know comes from whispers, diaries, and the oral traditions of those who lived nearby. Historians struggle to separate fact from fear, while paranormal enthusiasts embrace every shadow as proof of the supernatural. Perhaps the bodies truly were preserved within the barn, untouched by decay. Perhaps the Graysons did practice strange rituals that blurred the line between medicine, science, and the occult. Or perhaps it was all a tale born of suspicion, exaggerated by generations eager for ghost stories. Yet the persistence of the legend speaks volumes. Stories that fade are often untrue. Stories that survive, that endure for centuries, usually carry some kernel of reality within them. The Grayson tale endures because it strikes at something primal, our fear of death, of being trapped, of silence that conceals unspeakable truths. As we close this journey into the macabre history of the Grayson homestead, one truth remains clear: some stories are not meant to be solved, only remembered. The barn may have collapsed, the Grayson family may have disappeared into history, but the legend refuses to die. It lives in the whispers of travelers, in the warnings of locals, and in the imaginations of those drawn to the unexplained. Perhaps the bodies are still there, hidden beneath the earth, waiting for another storm to uncover them. Perhaps their souls still linger, bound to the ruins of the barn, repeating the silence that consumed them in life. Or perhaps the true horror lies not in the supernatural, but in the very human capacity for secrecy, cruelty, and control. Whatever the truth, the Grayson homestead stands as a reminder that history is not always written in books, it is carved into the land, etched into memory, and whispered through time. And as long as the story is told, the barn will never truly fall silent. For in the stillness of its ruin, in the silence of its fields, one can almost hear it, the faintest echo of voices long gone, waiting, forever waiting, to be heard again.